Hello and welcome to Episode 2 of Themed Environments 101, a series that explores themed environment history, design practices, and integration. If you'd like to support this channel, please subscribe and give this video a like. As mentioned in Episode 1, I am working on a Patreon where you will have early access to new videos, a say in future episodes, exclusive content, and merchandise. In our last video, we explored how Middle-Age churches served as the first story-driven environments by allowing the society of the time to realize that stories could be experiential. We also touched briefly on landscaped gardens as early examples of location-based experiences. Today, we will dive deeper into the trends that came together to create the modern theme park. Enjoy the video. As we learned in the last video, themed environments, and by definition theme parks, find their origin in gardens and churches of the Middle Ages. But these spaces, dedicated to the arts and the spirit, are far from what any modern guest would consider a theme park. In the 18th and 19th centuries, a set of trends would slowly converge and create what we now consider the first theme parks. In his paper titled Gardens, a Physical Manifestation of Culture, former Imagineer Steve Grant discusses the idea of gardens as an expression of cultural values and beliefs, an art form that evolves over time to reflect the ever-changing cultural outlook. From the early classical gardens, the landscaped environment evolved into what was considered a high art form by the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The neoclassical gardens of the 18th century embraced the natural landscape with winding paths, rolling hills, lakes, and streams. These gardens are, quote, theatrical, being laid out in a sequence of scenes that the observer views as he walks through it. The neoclassical eventually evolved into the English garden. The English landscape garden was less theatrical but leaned heavily into the sublime. Quote, the English garden evolved from the neoclassical garden of classical stories and ideals to the romantic garden of sensibility, impressions and emotions, rationalism to empiricism. Sublime is a hard quality to define. You can think of it as the awe we feel when taking in the transcendent beauty of the world around us. In 1757, Edmund Burke made a clear distinction, though, between beauty and the sublime. He associated sublime with the kind of awe we feel when confronted with objects that exceed our control, and the beautiful with all the things that we take to be pleasant because they submit to us. Burke's ideas helped bridge aesthetics with emotion and philosophy. This inspired a new form of art called Romanticism. Romanticism emphasized the individual, the subjective, the irrational, the imaginative, the personal, the spontaneous, the emotional, the visionary, and the transcendental. Romanticism became a new way to look at the world and create art. The Romanticism movement also promoted and evolved on another neoclassical custom, the Grand Tour. Through most of the 17th and 18th centuries, the Grand Tour was a customary tour through Europe taken on by young, upper-class British nobility. By the mid-18th century, it had become a staple of upper-class aristocratic education in Europe. It provided exposure to culture, art, and antiquity. The Grand Tour promoted the idea that certain places and cultures were worth experiencing and contemplating. This contemplation an illuminating part of education. During the late 18th and early 19th century, the United States was rapidly industrializing. This created the middle class. This new societal class lacked access to the traditional Grand Tour and the sublime English gardens. But this did not stop them from wanting to experience and contemplate culture, art, and antiquity. This market demand, combined with rapid technological innovation, allowed endeavoring entrepreneurs to develop location-based, themed experiences that were accessible to the newly formed middle class. A new form of placemaking mediated by technological effects and architecture. The old idea of the Grand Tour now evolving into tourism. In May of 1893, the World's Columbian Exposition opened in Chicago. The fair featured temporary neoclassical buildings across 690 acres with canals and water features throughout. It was also the first major venue with a dedicated area for amusement attractions, among them George Washington Ferris's Ferris wheel. One of the participants who would experience this new Ferris wheel was George C. Tillieu. He would be inspired by the fair to go on to create America's first amusement park, Steeplechase Park in Coney Island. While not quite a theme park by definition, Steeplechase proved that an amusement-focused, location-based experience was marketable. It laid the groundwork for much of what would be later adapted into the modern theme park. Over 27 million visitors attended the fair from May to October of 1893. The grand scale of the site and architecture rivaled anything the world had ever seen. It quickly became a symbol for growing American dominance and the new ideals that would become distinctly American. Concepts like progress, storytelling, and even theming were all driving this groundbreaking experience. Amusement, combined with architecture, tourism, and a growing demand to experience edifying places, would ultimately converge to create the early theme parks. Places like Luna Park, Tivoli Gardens, Cedar Point, and Midway State Park would all add amusements to their existing garden-like leisure operations. Many of these parks lacked a central narrative and were limited in their scope of experience. However, they laid the groundwork for what would become a distinctly American enterprise, the theme park. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video on the development of early themed environments. Feel free to comment below and don't forget to subscribe. I'll see you next time.